The Nebula's Edge Tavern sat on the edge of space station Kythera Prime like a forgotten memory. The place was old and dark, with smoke hanging in the air and lights that flickered more than they shone. It was the kind of place where beings from across the galaxy came to drink away their problems and pretend tomorrow would never come. The tavern was busy tonight. At least 50 different aliens filled the tables and booths, speaking in languages that sounded like music, grinding metal, and whistling wind. The air smelled of exotic drinks and the nervous sweat of creatures who had traveled too far from home. Near the bar, 3 towering Vorthak warriors stood in a circle. Their bodies looked like living crystal, blue and sharp, catching the dim light and throwing it back in rainbow patterns. They spoke in voices that rang like temple bells, discussing trade routes and the price of rare metals. Each one stood nearly 8 feet tall and carried themselves like they owned the universe. At a round table in the center, a group of Manthari traders clicked and buzzed at each other. They looked like giant insects with 4 arms each and eyes like black jewels that reflected everything around them. Their mandibles moved constantly as they ate something that looked like purple soup but smelled like flowers. In the corner near the old music player, a cloud of gas that called itself an Etherian drifted slowly around a special chair made just for its kind. The gas was green tonight, though everyone knew Etherians could change color with their mood. It was talking to a small, furry creature from the outer rim about shipping costs and fuel prices. The tavern owner, Brix, moved between the tables with the easy grace of someone who had been doing this job for 50 years. He was Centauri, which meant he looked almost human except for the blue skin and the extra set of arms. His 4 hands carried drinks, wiped tables, and counted money without him seeming to think about it. But in the darkest corner of the tavern, away from the main crowd, sat someone different. A human. His name was Deho, though most people in the tavern did not know that. They just saw another human trader, one of the thousands who moved goods between the worlds now that Earth had finally joined the galactic community. He looked to be in his 50s with gray hair and hands that showed the scars of hard work. His clothes were simple and clean, the kind spacers wore when they wanted to blend in and not draw attention. Deho sat alone at a small table, slowly drinking something brown from a glass that had seen better days. The bottle next to his glass had writing on it that said Terran whiskey in 3 different languages. He had been nursing the same drink for over an hour, watching the crowd and saying nothing to anyone. Most of the aliens in the tavern paid him no attention at all. Humans were still new to the galaxy, and most species thought of them as quiet traders who kept to themselves. They were not warriors like the Vorthak, or master merchants like the Manthari, or ancient and wise like the Etherians. They were just humans, and humans were ordinary. The peace of the evening was broken when the tavern's main door slid open with a hiss. 6 young soldiers walked in, wearing the dark blue uniforms of the Galactic Coalition Defense Force. They were mixed species, 2 Vorthak, 2 Manthari, 1 Etherian in a special containment suit, and, surprisingly, 1 human. The soldiers moved with the swagger of beings who had just won a fight. They found a large table near the center of the room and called loudly for drinks. Other patrons turned to look at them, and conversations grew quiet as everyone waited to see what would happen. "Bartender," called the tallest Vorthak soldier, his crystal body flashing bright blue with excitement. "Bring us your best drinks. We are celebrating." Brix hurried over with a tray of glasses filled with different colored liquids. "What are we celebrating tonight, friends?" The Manthari soldier clicked her mandibles together in what her species considered a smile. "We just finished cleaning out a nest of pirate raiders in the Kelpsa system. 37 ships destroyed, and we did not lose a single vessel." The Etherian soldier's voice came through his suit's speaker, sounding proud and metallic. It was the greatest space battle in the Outer Rim for 50 years. The pirates never knew what hit them. The human soldier, a young woman who looked barely old enough to be away from her home planet, nodded eagerly. "Our new targeting systems are amazing. We could hit their ships from twice the distance they could shoot back." It was like they were standing still. The other patrons in the tavern began to murmur appreciatively. The Vorthak near the bar moved closer to hear better, their crystal bodies chiming softly with interest. Even the Manthari traders stopped eating their purple soup to listen. "Tell us about the battle," said one of the Vorthak civilians, his voice carrying the respect his species always showed to warriors. The soldiers were happy to oblige. They talked about their advanced ships, their superior weapons, and their perfect tactical computers. They described how they had surrounded the pirate fleet and destroyed it piece by piece, using mathematics and technology to win a flawless victory. The tavern listened with growing admiration. This was how civilized beings fought wars, with planning, technology, and overwhelming force applied precisely where it would do the most good. It was clean, efficient, and proved the superiority of coalition training and equipment. As the soldiers continued their story, describing the exact number of ships destroyed and the precise time it had taken to complete their mission, a sound came from the dark corner of the tavern. It was soft, barely audible over the soldiers' voices and the general noise of the crowd. But in the moment between one sentence and the next, several patrons heard it clearly. Someone was chuckling. The sound came from the human in the corner, the quiet trader who had been sitting alone all evening. Deho had lifted his glass to his lips and was shaking his head slightly, a small smile playing around the edges of his mouth. The Vorthak soldier who had been speaking stopped mid-sentence. His crystal body flashed from blue to red, the color of anger among his kind. "Did someone find our story amusing?" The tavern went completely silent. Every conversation stopped. Every drink was set down and every eye turned toward the corner where Deho sat. The human looked up from his glass, meeting the soldier's gaze with calm brown eyes. "Not amusing," Deho said quietly, his voice carrying easily in the sudden silence. "Just familiar." The word hung in the air like a challenge nobody quite understood. The silence in the tavern stretched like a tight rope ready to snap. Every being in the room stared at the human in the corner, waiting to see what would happen next. The coalition soldiers looked confused and angry, while the civilian aliens watched with the fascination of creatures about to witness a fight. The tallest Vorthak soldier stepped away from his table, his crystal body now burning bright red with anger. His name was Quillix, and he had served in the Coalition Defense Force for 20 years. He had fought pirates, rebels, and raiders across a dozen star systems. No one, especially not some quiet human trader, was going to mock his achievements. "Familiar?" Quillix's voice rang through the tavern like a struck bell, each word sharp with indignation. "You think you know something about real warfare, human?" Deho set his glass down carefully and looked up at the towering alien warrior. The Vorthak stood nearly 8 feet tall and weighed twice what any human could. His crystalline body could deflect most small weapons, and his natural strength could crush bones with a casual grip. But the human showed no fear, just a tired sort of patience. "I did not mean to offend," Deho said quietly. "Please continue your story." But Quillix was not satisfied with such a simple dismissal. The red glow in his crystal body pulsed brighter as his anger grew. "No, you laughed at us. At warriors who risked their lives to protect innocent beings from pirates. What gives you the right?" The Manthari soldier, whose name was Zephys, clicked her mandibles together in agreement. Her forearms crossed over her chest as she studied the human with compound eyes that reflected the tavern's dim lights. "Humans always think they know better than everyone else," she said, her voice buzzing with irritation. "Your species has barely been in space for 50 years. What could you possibly know about real war?" The Etherian soldier drifted closer in his containment suit, his gaseous form shifting from green to yellow with curiosity and annoyance. His electronic voice crackled through the suit's speakers. "My people have fought wars for over 1,000 years. The Vorthak have conquered entire sectors. The Manthari have built the greatest trading empire in the galaxy. But humans? Humans just appeared one day and started moving cargo between worlds." Other aliens in the tavern began to murmur agreement. The 3 Vorthak civilians near the bar chimed their approval, their bodies flashing blue with solidarity for their warrior kinsmen. The Manthari traders clicked and buzzed among themselves, clearly thinking the human had overstepped his bounds. Even Brix, the Centauri bartender, looked nervous as he moved between the tables with his forearms full of drinks. He had seen fights start over much smaller insults, and a brawl between species could destroy his tavern and get him banned from the station. Deho seemed to consider the alien's words carefully. He picked up his glass again and took a slow sip of the brown liquid inside. The whiskey was from Earth, one of the few things his home planet exported that other species found interesting. Most aliens could not drink it without getting sick, but Deho had been drinking it for 30 years. "You are right," he said finally, looking around the room at all the angry faces. "Humans are new to space. We do not have great empires or ancient warrior traditions. Most of us are just trying to make a living and stay out of trouble. Some of the tension in the room eased slightly. It seemed the human was going to apologize and let the matter drop. Quillix's crystal body began to fade from red back toward its normal blue, and Zephys uncrossed her arms. But then Deho continued speaking. "But you asked what I know about war," he said, his voice still quiet but somehow carrying more weight than before. "And the truth is I know quite a bit about it. More than I would like to, actually." The tension snapped back into the room like a rubber band. Quillix's body flared red again, brighter than before. "You? A cargo hauler who probably runs away at the first sign of trouble? What could you possibly know about real combat?" Deho looked up at the Vorthak warrior with eyes that seemed older than his weathered face. "Would you like me to tell you about a war?" The question hung in the air like smoke. It was asked so simply, so calmly, that it took a moment for everyone to realize what the human had just offered. Not a fight, not an argument, but a story. Zephys clicked her mandibles impatiently. What kind of war could one human traitor have seen that we have not heard about? The Etherian soldier's gaseous form swirled faster inside his suit. The only wars humans have fought have been small colonial disputes. Nothing worth talking about. But Quillix studied the human more carefully now. Something in Deho's eyes, something in the way he held himself made the Vorthak warrior pause. Quillix had seen that look before, in the faces of soldiers who had been through battles that changed them forever. "Very well," Quillix said, his voice losing some of its anger and gaining a note of genuine curiosity. "Tell us about this war of yours, human, but make it worth our time." The other coalition soldiers gathered closer along with many of the civilian aliens. Even the Manthari traders abandoned their purple soup to listen. Brick stopped serving drinks and found reasons to wipe down tables near the human's corner. Deho finished the whiskey in his glass and set it down with a soft click. He was quiet for a long moment as if deciding where to begin. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of memory and loss. "It was not a big war by galactic standards," he said. "Just one planet, really. A human colony world called New Busan. Most of you have probably never heard of it." He paused, looking around the room at all the expectant faces. "But after what happened there, the whole galaxy learned our name." The tavern had become completely silent now. Even the background music had stopped, and the only sound was the soft hum of the space station's life support systems. Every alien in the room leaned forward slightly, waiting for the human to continue his story. Deho stared down at his empty glass for a moment, as if seeing something in the bottom that no one else could see. When he looked up again, his eyes seemed to be focused on something far away and long ago. "New Busan was a farming world," he began, his voice steady but soft. "Nothing special about it, really. Good soil, clean water, decent weather. The kind of place people go when they want to raise their children somewhere safe and quiet." He gestured to Brix, who quickly brought over another bottle of the Terran whiskey. Deho poured himself a new drink but did not touch it yet. "There were about 12,000 people living there when it happened," he continued. "Mostly families. Farmers, engineers, teachers, shop owners. My younger sister Yunji worked there as a terraforming engineer, helping to make the soil better for growing food. My old friend Jinwoo had moved there with his wife to work as a security officer." Quillix shifted impatiently, his crystal body flickering between blue and red. "This sounds like a peaceful colony story, not a war story." Deho nodded. "It was peaceful. That was the problem." The human took a sip of his fresh drink and continued. "New Busan sat on top of some very valuable mineral deposits. Rare earth metals that are used in starship engines and quantum computers. The kind of stuff that makes people very rich if they can dig it up and sell it." Several of the Manthari traders clicked their mandibles together knowingly. They understood the economics of rare minerals very well. "The hegemony found out about the deposits," Deho said, and several aliens in the tavern hissed or made other sounds of recognition. Everyone knew about the hegemony, a loose alliance of 3 different species who had been expanding their territory for decades through conquest and intimidation. Zephys leaned forward, her compound eyes reflecting the tavern's lights. "The hegemony does not usually bother with small human colonies. Too much trouble for too little gain." "Usually," Deho agreed. "But these deposits were worth billions of credits. Enough to make it worth their while to take one small farming world away from a bunch of humans who could not fight back." The Etherian soldier's gaseous form swirled faster in his containment suit. "How many ships did they send?" Deho was quiet for a moment as if counting something in his head. 200 warships, cruisers, destroyers, troop transports, support vessels. Everything they needed to take a planet and hold it. A low murmur went around the tavern. 200 ships was a serious invasion fleet, the kind of force that could conquer most worlds without breaking a sweat. What did the colony have for defense? Asked one of the Vorthak civilians near the bar. 6 patrol boats, Deho said simply. Old ones left over from the early colony ships. They were meant for chasing off pirates and wild animals, not fighting a real war. The aliens exchanged glances. 6 patrol boats against 200 warships was not a fight. It was a massacre waiting to happen. The hegemony commander sent a standard surrender demand. Deho continued. Very polite, very reasonable. The colonists could surrender peacefully and be relocated to other worlds, while the hegemony strip-mined their planet. Standard procedure for this kind of takeover. Quillix's crystal body had faded to its normal blue color now, his anger replaced by professional interest. A smart colony would have surrendered immediately. Live to fight another day, as we say. That is what everyone expected them to do, Deho agreed. The hegemony gave them 24 hours to think it over, confident that 12,000 farmers and shopkeepers would see sense and give up without a fight. He lifted his glass and took another sip, letting the silence stretch for a moment before continuing. The colony council met that night in the main town hall, all the elected representatives plus anyone else who wanted to have a say. About 3,000 people showed up, nearly a quarter of the entire population. Brix had stopped even pretending to work now, standing behind the bar with his forearms crossed, listening intently. They talked all night, Deho said, about their options, about their chances, about what would happen to their children if they gave up their home. Jinwoo stood up near dawn and said something that I will never forget. The human paused, staring into his glass again. What did he say? Zephys asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Deho looked up at the Manthari soldier. He said that sometimes in life, you have to choose between living on your knees or dying on your feet, and that he would rather teach his children to fight for what was theirs than to teach them that running away was the smart thing to do. The tavern was so quiet now that everyone could hear their own breathing. The vote was not even close, Deho continued. 10,000 in favor of fighting, less than 2,000 in favor of surrender. The colony sent their answer to the hegemony the next morning. They said no, the Etherian soldier asked, his electronic voice crackling with disbelief. They said no, Deho confirmed, and then they sent a message to Earth asking for just one thing. Reinforcements? Quillix guessed. Deho shook his head. Time. They asked Earth for 90 days before any rescue ships arrived. 90 days to prepare. The aliens looked at each other in confusion. What could 12,000 civilians do with 90 days that would make any difference against 200 warships? The hegemony thought it was funny, Deho said, a bitter smile crossing his face. 90 days for a bunch of farmers to get ready for war? They were curious to see what the humans would try to build. It would be amusing, they said. He finished the whiskey in his glass and set it down hard enough to make a sharp sound against the table. They stopped thinking it was funny pretty quickly. Deho poured himself another drink, his movements slow and deliberate. The bottle was now half empty, but his voice remained steady and clear. Around the tavern, aliens who had been standing found chairs or leaned against walls, settling in for what they were beginning to realize would be a long story. 90 days, Deho repeated, rolling the whiskey around in his glass. The hegemony commanders were so confident that they actually pulled most of their fleet back to a safe distance. They left just enough ships in orbit to make sure no one could escape, and then they waited to see what kind of pathetic defenses a bunch of farmers could build. Quillix's crystal body chimed softly as he shifted his weight. What did the colonists actually do with those 90 days? Deho's eyes took on a distant look as if he was seeing the events play out in his mind. My sister Yunji was a terraforming engineer, like I said. Her job was to reshape entire planets, to move rivers and change weather patterns and turn dead rock into living worlds. She knew New Busan better than anyone. Every underground water system, every weak point in the geology, every cave and canyon and hidden valley. He took a sip of his drink before continuing. She spent those 90 days turning the planet into a weapon. The Manthari trader who had been sitting quietly near the wall clicked her mandibles in confusion. A weapon? How do you turn a planet into a weapon? Carefully, Deho replied, and with a lot of explosives. He began to describe what Yunji and her engineering teams had accomplished in those 3 months. Using mining equipment and homemade explosives, they had redirected 3 major underground rivers, creating a network of flooded tunnels that connected every major settlement on the continent. They had weakened key geological formations so that a small explosion could trigger massive landslides. They had built hidden bunkers and supply caches connected by natural cave systems that the colonists expanded and reinforced. Meanwhile, Daeho continued, Jinwoo was working on the human side of the equation. The young human coalition soldier leaned forward. What do you mean? Jinwoo had been a soldier before he became a security officer, Daeho explained. He had studied old Earth wars, battles from before humans ever left their home planet. He knew that 12,000 civilians could not fight like trained soldiers. So he taught them to fight like something else. Like what? Zephys asked. Like people defending their homes, Daeho said simply. Like parents protecting their children. Like human beings who had decided they would rather die fighting than live as slaves. The human described how Jinwoo had organized the colonists into small, mobile groups. Farmers learned to make bombs from fertilizer. Teachers learned to move through the tunnel networks like ghosts. Shopkeepers learned to set traps and ambushes. Children as young as 12 were taught to carry messages and supplies through passages too small for adults. They had no illusions about winning a straight fight, Daeho said, his voice growing quieter. But Jinwoo remembered something from old Earth history. Sometimes the point is not to win. Sometimes the point is to make the enemy pay such a high price that they think twice before they try something like this again. The Etherian soldier's gaseous form had changed from yellow to a deep blue, the color his species showed when they were thinking hard. What happened when the hegemony finally attacked? Daeho stared into his glass for a long moment before answering. The hegemony expected to end the rebellion in a week. They had overwhelming firepower, superior technology, and professional soldiers. They landed 50,000 troops in the first wave and began their march on the main settlements. He paused, taking another drink. The first thing that went wrong was that there were no settlements to march on. Quillix's crystal body flickered with confusion. What do you mean? The colonists had abandoned all the towns and cities, Daeho explained. Every building was empty, every street was deserted. But the buildings were not really empty. Yunji had turned each one into a trap, rigged with explosives and connected to her tunnel system. When the hegemony soldiers entered the towns, the colonists could attack from underground and then disappear before anyone could fight back. The tavern was completely silent now except for Daeho's voice. Even Brix had stopped moving, standing frozen behind the bar with a glass in each of his 4 hands. It took the hegemony 3 days to secure the first town. Daeho continued. Every building had to be searched, every tunnel had to be mapped, every trap had to be found and disarmed. And just when they thought they had it under control, the colonists would flood the area with those redirected rivers, or trigger a landslide that buried entire city blocks. He described how the hegemony had brought in specialists, engineers from a dozen worlds who were experts at urban warfare and siege tactics. Each new strategy worked for a few days, until the humans adapted and found ways to counter it. The colonists learned fast, Daeho said, a note of pride creeping into his voice despite the sadness in his eyes. Every time the hegemony tried something new, it only took Jinwoo's people a day or two to figure out a response. They started using the hegemony's own tactics against them, capturing weapons and equipment and turning them into new kinds of traps. How long did this go on? Asked one of the Vorthak civilians. Daeho finished his drink and looked around the room at all the expectant faces. 14 months, he said quietly. The hegemony said it would take a week to crush the rebellion. Instead, it took them over a year, and they had to call in reinforcements 3 different times. The number hung in the air like a physical weight. 14 months of constant warfare, of farmers and teachers fighting professional soldiers with nothing but determination and homemade weapons. The hegemony won. Eventually, Daeho continued, his voice barely above a whisper now. They had to. There were only 12,000 humans to begin with, and even the best fighters cannot hold out forever against unlimited reinforcements. He poured himself another drink, but his hands were not quite steady now. But by the time it was over, they had learned something about humans that they were not expecting to learn. The whiskey bottle was nearly empty now, and Daeho's eyes had taken on the glassy look of someone staring into the past. But his voice remained steady as he continued the story that had turned the entire tavern into a congregation of silent listeners. The mathematics were brutal, he said, running his finger around the rim of his glass. 12,000 colonists at the start, men, women, and children, against a professional army that grew from 50,000 to over 200,000 as the war dragged on. Quillix's crystal body had stopped flickering entirely, frozen in a dull blue that reflected the tavern's dim lights. What were the casualty numbers? He asked, though his voice suggested he was not sure he wanted to know the answer. Deho was quiet for a long moment, counting something in his head that only he could see. For every human who died defending New Busan, 7 hegemony soldiers fell. The silence that followed was complete. Even the space station's life support system seemed to have gone quiet. Cephas clicked her mandibles once, a sound like breaking glass in the stillness. That is impossible. Civilians cannot achieve that kind of kill ratio against trained soldiers. You are right, Deho agreed. Civilians cannot. But these were not civilians anymore. After the first month of fighting, they were something else entirely. He began to describe what the colonists had become during those 14 months of siege. The original battle plans and careful strategies had given way to something more primal and desperate. Mothers who had lost their children became expert snipers, picking off hegemony officers from hiding places that took weeks to find. Fathers who had watched their homes burn became demolition experts, creating bombs that could destroy entire city blocks. Jinwoo stopped trying to coordinate traditional military tactics after the 3rd month, Deho said. Instead, he just gave people targets and let them figure out their own ways to reach them. A shopkeeper named Mrs. Park spent 6 months hunting a single hegemony colonel who had ordered the bombing of a school. She killed him with a knife made from a piece of farming equipment, in his own command bunker surrounded by 50 guards. The human coalition soldier, who had been silent for most of the story, finally spoke. How did she get past 50 guards? Deho looked at her with eyes that had seen too much. She walked through the front door during a prisoner exchange. She had volunteered to be captured so she could get close enough to use her knife. The hegemony never found her body. She died in the explosion when she set off the grenades she had hidden under her clothes. The young soldier turned pale and looked down at her hands. That is what the hegemony was fighting by the end, Deho continued. Not soldiers, not even guerrillas. They were fighting people who had decided that their own lives were an acceptable price to pay for taking down the enemy. He described how the colonists had adapted to every new tactic the hegemony tried. When the invaders brought in heavy armor, the humans learned to attack the supply convoys that kept the tanks fueled. When the hegemony started using aerial bombardment, the colonists moved deeper underground and turned the bombed-out ruins into new kinds of fortresses. When the invaders tried to cut off their food supplies, the colonists started eating things that would have made most species sick and kept fighting. By month 10, Deho said, the hegemony had stopped calling it a pacification operation. Their own soldiers were calling New Busan the ghost planet. They said the very ground was cursed, that the spirits of dead humans were haunting their dreams. Bricks finally moved, setting down the glasses he had been holding and pouring himself a drink with shaking hands. That sounds like superstition, he said weakly. Maybe, Deho replied. But when your soldiers start seeing enemies in every shadow, when every building could be a trap and every piece of debris could be hiding a bomb, superstition starts feeling like reality. The Etherian soldier's gaseous form had turned almost black now, the color his species showed when experiencing deep distress. How many hegemony ships did they lose? 2/3 of their original fleet, Deho said without hesitation. The colonists could not fight them in space, but they could make the ground so dangerous that supply ships stopped wanting to land. Pilots started demanding hazard pay just to enter New Busan's atmosphere. Some crews mutinied rather than make another supply run. He refilled his glass with the last of the whiskey and held it up to the light, watching the amber liquid catch the tavern's dim glow. The hegemony brought in specialists from 12 different worlds, he continued. Urban warfare experts, siege engineers, psychological warfare specialists, even torturer interrogators who were supposed to break the colonists' will to fight. Every single one of them failed. What happened to them? Quillix asked. Most of them died, Deho said simply. The ones who survived went home and told their governments never to fight humans if they could possibly avoid it. The human stared into his glass as he continued the story. By month 12, the hegemony had 400,000 soldiers on New Busan. They controlled every major city, every spaceport, every piece of strategic territory, but they still could not stop the attacks. He described the final phase of the siege, when the colonists had been reduced to small groups hiding in the deepest caves and underground bunkers. They had no heavy weapons left, no communications equipment, no way to coordinate their attacks, but they kept fighting anyway, emerging from the darkness to strike at hegemony patrols and then disappearing again like ghosts. Yoonji died in month 13, Daeho said, his voice finally showing the strain of telling the story. Tunnel collapsed during one of the final bombing runs. She was trying to rescue some children who had gotten trapped when the hegemony found one of our last bunkers. The tavern was so quiet that everyone could hear their own heartbeat. Jinwoo made it almost to the end. He was killed 2 days before the last resistance group finally surrendered. Sniper's bullet while he was covering the evacuation of the final group of children. Daeho lifted his glass and drained it in one long swallow, then set it down with finality. The war ended on a Tuesday morning in the 14th month. 63 colonists walked out of the caves and surrendered to 400,000 hegemony soldiers. He looked around the room at all the stunned alien faces. 63. People had held out against an entire army for over a year. Daeho set his empty glass down on the table and looked around the tavern. Every single alien in the room was staring at him with expressions that ranged from shock to horror to something that might have been respect. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. Finally, Zephys spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. Why? The word came out as a broken click from her mandibles. Why did they not just leave? They could have evacuated to other worlds. They could have lived. Daeho studied the Manthari soldiers' compound eyes, seeing his own reflection multiplied dozens of times in their dark surfaces. Because some things matter more than just staying alive, he said quietly. Because when someone comes to take your home, to take everything you have built and everything you love, sometimes your choice is not between living and dying. Sometimes your choice is between dying on your knees or dying on your feet. The young human coalition soldier had tears running down her face, but they all died anyway. What was the point? Did they? Daeho asked, turning to look at her. Did they really die for nothing? He stood up slowly, his movements careful and deliberate. The alcohol had not affected his balance, but something else had, the weight of carrying the story for so many years. 3 months after New Busan fell, he continued, the hegemony received a formal message from the Earth government. It was very short and very polite. Earth wanted to arrange a prisoner exchange for the 63 survivors. Quillix's crystal body flickered with confusion. That sounds like standard diplomatic procedure. It was, Daeho agreed. Except Earth also mentioned that they had recently completed construction of their first real military fleet. 200 ships all armed with weapons designed, specifically for fighting the kind of war that had just ended on New Busan. The aliens in the tavern began to understand what they were hearing. The Earth message was very clear, Daeho continued. They wanted their people back, and if the hegemony preferred to keep them, Earth was prepared to come get them. The Etherian soldier's gaseous form swirled faster in his containment suit. They were threatening war over 63 prisoners? Not threatening, Daeho corrected. Promising. The message included detailed specifications for Earth's new weapons, along with tactical plans for exactly how they intended to use them. Plans based on everything they had learned from studying the New Busan siege. He began to walk toward the tavern's exit, moving slowly so that everyone could hear his words. The hegemony released the prisoners within a week, he said. No negotiations, no demands for concessions. They put all 63 survivors on the fastest ship they had and sent them home with a formal apology for any inconvenience. Brix finally found his voice, though it came out as a croak. What happened then? Daeho paused near the door, his hand resting on the frame. Word spread. The hegemony military started calling New Busan the lesson planet. They used it as a training example for what happens when you underestimate an enemy's will to fight. He turned back to face the room full of silent aliens. Within 6 months, 3 different alien empires sent ambassadors to Earth, requesting formal peace treaties, not trade agreements or mutual defense pacts, peace treaties. documents that specifically promised never to attack human worlds or human ships. Quillix's crystal body was glowing brighter now, but with a white light instead of the angry red from earlier. They were afraid. They were smart, Deho replied. They had heard about New Busan. They knew that humans would fight like that again if they had to. The young human soldier wiped her eyes with her sleeve. Would we? Would all humans really fight like that? Deho looked at her for a long moment, seeing something in her face that reminded him of Jin Woo when they were both young, and thought they understood how the universe worked. I hope you never have to find out, he said gently. But yes, every single one of us if pushed far enough. That is not a threat or a boast. That is just who we are. He began to open the door, then stopped and looked back one more time. We are the species that looked at an impossible siege and decided that impossible just meant it would take longer. We are the people who chose to make our enemies remember our names, even if we did not live to hear them say it. The door slid open, letting in a brief glimpse of the space station's artificial night. Before he stepped through, Deho added one final thought. The hegemony never attacked another human world, not because they could not win, but because they finally understood what winning would cost them. As the door closed behind him, the tavern remained completely silent. No one moved, no one spoke, no one even seemed to breathe. The story hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre, impossible to ignore and impossible to forget. Finally, Voss the Etherean spoke, his electronic voice crackling with something that might have been awe. Do you think he was telling the truth? Quillix's crystal body resonated with a low, deep sound, the note his species made when contemplating something that changed their understanding of the universe. I think it does not matter whether he was telling the truth about every detail, the Vorthak warrior said slowly. What matters is that he could tell that story and make us believe it. What matters is that somewhere out there might be more humans like the ones he described. Zephys clicked her mandibles together in a rhythm that indicated deep thought among her people. When I look at human ships in spaceports now, when I see human traders going about their business, I will remember this story. I will wonder which ones have siblings like Yunji or friends like Jin Woo. The young coalition soldiers sat quietly at their table, their earlier celebration forgotten. Their victory against the pirates suddenly seemed smaller, less significant, compared to what they had just heard. Brix began moving between the tables again, but more slowly than before, his forearms working automatically while his mind processed what he had learned. Several patrons asked for their checks and left without finishing their drinks, suddenly eager to be elsewhere, but most of the aliens remained, sitting in thoughtful silence or speaking in hushed voices about what they had heard. The story of New Busan had changed something in the room, something that could not be unchanged by simply walking away. The three Vorthak civilians near the bar had moved closer together, their crystal bodies chiming softly as they discussed what they had learned. One of them, an elder whose body showed the deep blue of great age, spoke in the formal tones his species used for important pronouncements. I have fought in 17 campaigns across 9 star systems, he said, his voice carrying clearly through the quiet tavern. I have seen courage and cowardice, victory and defeat, but I have never heard of anything like what that human described. The Manthari traders had abandoned their purple soup entirely, clicking and buzzing among themselves in rapid conversation. Their discussion was too fast for the universal translators to follow completely, but the words 14 months and 12,000 kept repeating. Near the corner where Deho had been sitting, his empty whiskey glass still caught the light like a small monument to the story he had told. Brix had not cleared the table yet, as if he understood that something important had happened there, and was reluctant to erase the evidence. The young human coalition soldier finally stood up from her table, her legs unsteady but her voice clear. I need to send a message to my family, she said to no one in particular. I need to tell them about this. Her alien teammates watched her go with expressions that suggested they were having similar thoughts about their own families and friends. As the evening wore on, the tavern slowly returned to its normal rhythm, but something fundamental had changed. Conversations were quieter, more thoughtful. When humans entered the establishment later that night, they were greeted with a different kind of attention than before, not dismissive or condescending, but watchful and respectful. Quillix remained at the bar longer than anyone else, his crystal body cycling slowly through different shades of blue as he processed what he had heard. When Brix finally approached to ask if he wanted another drink, the Vorthak warrior looked up with eyes that seemed to see the universe differently than they had a few hours before. "That human," Quilix said slowly. "Will he be back tomorrow?" Brix nodded, his forearms working to clean glasses that were already spotless. "He comes in most evenings, sits in that same corner, drinks the same whiskey, usually keeps to himself." "But not always?" Quilix asked. The Centauri bartender paused in his cleaning, looking toward the empty table in the corner. "Sometimes when the mood is right and someone asks the right question, he tells stories. Stories that make you think about things differently." Quilix's crystal body chimed softly, a sound of understanding and perhaps anticipation. "I think I would like to hear more of his stories." "I think," Brix said quietly, "that you are not the only one." As the artificial night deepened around Kythera Prime Space Station, the Nebula's Edge Tavern settled into its usual late-evening quiet. But in the minds of everyone who had been there that night, the echo of Daeho's story continued to resonate. The tale of New Busan had become part of them now, a reminder that throughout the galaxy, in the most ordinary-looking beings, extraordinary stories waited to be told. And somewhere in the station's Risai,